Imagine this. The moment that Tom took his first breath in heaven, the Lord was right there to welcome him. The first image Tom saw was the Lord Jesus Christ. Christ was there with his arms wide open to receive him. I can only imagine that Tom suddenly notices the heavenly strength surges through his body. The adrenaline rush that kept him going during those racing seasons is back. His mind is crystal clear, and he enjoys the health and strength of his youth. The Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 9, "No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him." Imagine what awaits us as we enter eternal life. And what I just read was from the message from Father Dale Grubba at the funeral of my grandfather, Tom Reffner. And today I happen to have with me in my studio that man himself, Father Dale Grubba. Father Grubba, welcome, and thank you for coming today.
Oh, I enjoy it. Thank you for inviting me, and I think we'll have a good conversation. As one of the things I thought about is, as you were reading that introduction, was that, Tom was a person of deep faith, and you couldn't be with him very long, but you realized that he was that man of faith.
Yeah.
And so it was an honor to know him, but it was also an honor to speak at his funeral and to review not only his racing life, but many other things that were a part of his life, his family life, and then again his faith life. And we had many conversations just about that. I remember one not too long ago, maybe 2-3 years ago, at Golden Sand Speedway, where we sat and talked, and I was putting together that book on 67, and we spent the afternoon just talking about many things, but one of the things that was prominent that day was his journey in faith, and how his parents were faith-filled people also, and how he fed off of that, and then his own faith grew as a result of that. So it was a real honor to speak at his funeral. It's a real honor to have him as one of my memories of good people and just solid people. So thank you for inviting me to be here today.
Yeah, it's absolutely. And why I wanted to start off with that is I think as the days have gone by, the months have gone by that he hasn't been with us, I think a lot on that day. I think a lot on the funeral itself, but your message that you had, most people think of funerals, everything is just sad, and people say, I think a lot of times, hey, the person that you lost and God, they want that day to be about, rejoicing and remembering that person that you lost. And I had never lost I've been very fortunate to not have a lot of loss in my family that were very close to me. And that was really definitely one of the first people that I had lost in my life that were very near and dear to me. And that day, especially during your message and what you read, I laughed, I smiled, I cried, I laughed again, I cried again, I laughed again. And when I think back on that day, of course it's sad, and of course I miss him, but I think because of, so many great people being around there, but then also what you wrote really makes that day special for me. And it gives me a feeling that I never really thought I would have about a day that, remembering a person that I lost. So, I want to thank you on behalf of me and, my entire family as well. It was, having you there was one of my grandpa's wishes, and I know my grandma wanted to make sure that happened.
Yes, it was one of his wishes. I think at one time, this is years ago, he and Dee Dee and I were talking, And he said, now he laid down kind of the rules. He said, now this is it. He said, half of the funeral is yours, so you plan half of it. But the other half is mine, and I want Father Grubba to speak at it. And so we always kind of laughed about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But, when I prepare funeral sermons and when I have funeral services, one of the things that I like to do is I like to mix both the sad and the good, because in life, in reality, we have good times and we have bad times. But the thing that's more important, especially at a funeral, is that it brings about closure, that it at the end of the service, people say to themselves, we have reviewed his life, we have laughed, we have so forth, and now we can close and move to a different chapter where we just think about his memories.
Yeah, and I think that kind of all that really held true for that day. So it, I think that's absolutely very true. Yeah, it's exactly how I feel about that day. So, yeah.
There's another thing too, is like with a lot of these, with Tom especially, it's always great when you have wonderful people that have done a lot of things, because you have things to talk about.
Right.
Good and bad, but that's always an exciting thing for me is, when I have to edit down instead of search for something to say, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. It's it was a perfect length, and you covered a lot from things that you had talked with my dad on and my uncle on and myself on. It was a great message that, like I said, I'll remember and kind of cherish forever, and really makes that day special for all of us, and I think anyone that was there or heard it. But yeah, so to really kind of cover you and to start talking about some of the things that you've done in your life, I think some of the things that really stand out to me is obviously you're a Catholic priest, you're an author, a writer, you've been involved in cycling marathons, right?
And running them.
Running them too.
Yeah, I ran 63 marathons.
Okay.
And I ran New York 18 times. I ran Boston 11 times, and any number of other marathons, especially here in Wisconsin. But that started when I was 40. I'm 84 now, but that started when I was 40. I thought, I've got to figure out how to do something that I'll remember my 40th birthday by. So I saw a book, a Runner's World book. See, because I had coached track and cross country when I taught at the seminary. And I saw this magazine on the way to Daytona, and it said, run your first marathon. And I thought, I should not pick that magazine up. I just should not buy that magazine because I know what's going to happen. So I bought it and thought, I could do this. And I followed the program that was in there and just thinking it was going to be a one-shot affair. And then as usual, the way things go,
you get that runner's high.
And not only that, but after about 6 or 7 weeks, you forget how much it hurt, and then you say, I could do a second one. So I did the first one in Milwaukee. The second one, I think, was in La Crosse, and then they just kept going, and then of course every runner's goal is to run Boston.
Yeah.
If you're a marathoner, that's your goal. And the first one that I was going to run, I think it was 1984. I was all signed up, and I still have the card, entry card for it. But what happened was, a dear friend of mine was Dan McClyman, who coached at the University of Wisconsin. He coached cross country, and then he coached distances in track.
Okay.
And he was just a dear friend. And at that time, if you were recruiting in some of those minor sports, private airline companies or friends that had planes would fly you to where there was a recruit. You would talk to them and then fly back home. And I was driving an old telephone van at the time with no radio, and I was out just making some final communion calls before going to Boston. And then I got home, and when I got home, and of course, remember, there wasn't any cell phones in those days either. So I got home and found out that Dan had been killed in an airplane crash. They were landing into Morey Field, which is on the small private field on the west side of Madison.
Okay.
And when they came down, he and the pilot, they hooked a tree on the top of a hill, and the plane crashed. And the pilot got out, but he burned to death in the plane.
Oh, wow.
And I knew right away that I would not be going to Boston, that I would be having that funeral. And it was on the day of the Boston Marathon. So I still have in my office a picture of Dan and then a picture of my entry card. So that was the first time. Then I didn't get back to it. I went from being a pastor at Waterloo to being a pastor in Princeton. And so there was a couple years there where I was just busy making that transition. And then I finally got back into doing Boston and New York and some of those other marathons. But I often think about that. I think the lesson to be learned is, and this would be true of being a race driver too, you can't put off things. Like you can't say, well, I'll do that when I retire, or I'll do that at a later point in my life. If you really want to do it, because if you don't, time will fly by, and you'll get too old to do it. And then you won't be able to enjoy what you really wanted to do and really would have enjoyed doing. So I think that was a key thing. Then what happened was eventually, my knees just said no more, and my back said no more, and I had knee replacement and back surgery. But I missed the scene so much, because I had done 63 marathons running. So I had to figure out a way to get back into it. And the way to get back into it is that I got back into it was I had a choice between wheelchairs or hand cycles. And hand cycle is like an upside-down bicycle, which you crank. Mm-hmm. And I decided on the hand cycle. So I think I've probably done at least 25 marathons now with the hand cycle.
Okay.
And it's a whole different type of exercise. I find it's actually much easier than running was. But there again, I've been to New York, I think 5 times with the hand cycle.
Okay.
And I haven't been to Boston, but I can't. They have different rules for Boston, and I don't think I can apply for that. But that whole thing, and I think the important thing about all of that was, when I look at my life now, I'm relatively healthy, and it's because I think of all of the exercising that I did, and that's made it possible for me to be very active yet in life. And so I'm happy about all of that. But I'm very competitive, too, like you as a race
when you're hanging
driver.
around racers for most of your life, it's I would imagine it's hard to go and not want to be competitive.
Yeah, it was funny because when I switched to hand cycles, I said to myself, I had a long talk with myself. I said, okay, now, your days of running are over, and your days of being competitive are over. And so the first marathon I did was Fox Valley, and we get towards the end. We're about, I'd say, 300 yards from the finish line, and I look ahead, and there's a guy up there about 200 yards away. And I thought, I bet I can beat him to the line. And I took off and beat him. And right away I got competitive, and I've stayed competitive. At New York, I know I beat two people who were probably half my age right at the finish, within about 50 yards of the finish. But, it's just part of the racer in me, I think.
Yeah.
But
no, that's awesome. That's great. You've been able to stay that healthy and fit for that long, and be able to be competitive.
I tell everybody, I wore the bottom half of my body out, and it's probably true. So now I'm wearing the upper part out, and then I'm going to just check out and go back to God, because it'll be over.
Oh, that's cool. I know my wife and I have been into running for probably 8 or 9 years. And between both of us she may have done 1 or 2 more half marathons than I have, but we've both done half marathons, and she doesn't have much of a desire to go any farther than that. I would like to do a marathon, and she's pushing me this year to have it be my first one. So if you have any words of advice or wisdom, I'll definitely take them from you.
I'll definitely. I've got programs laid out because there were people that approached me, and so in a sense, I kind of coached them as to how to do a marathon, and some of it, and not only that, but which ones are best, which ones are the fastest, and so forth. Because right away you're going to start looking at Boston. I know you say you don't, but and you
that average mile is a little fast for me right now.
Yeah, you have to get that. You have to have a qualifier to get into Boston. But that would be interesting. I'd love to just sit down and share everything with you. And if there's anybody that I've actually thought, I work out at Anytime Fitness, and I've actually thought of volunteering to coach marathoners.
Sure.
Especially starting marathoners, those that want to get involved in it. But marathons are a challenge like nothing else. You run the first 20 miles. It's 2 races, actually. You run the first 20 miles, and then the last 6 are just a race unto themselves.
Okay, that's a good way to look at it.
And that's the way that I look at it. So.
Neat. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. And I know the one thing that I see, people on social media doing nowadays are ultra marathons are really becoming popular, and watching people run 100, 200 miles. And that blows my mind.
I never did anything like that. I thought about doing like an ultra, like 50 on my 50th birthday, but this is what I was always afraid of. I was afraid that I would injure myself in a serious way.
Yeah.
And then I wouldn't be able to do what I really loved, which was to run marathons.
Yeah.
But just right now, there was talk about being competitive. There was a person from a fellow runner, and he was about 3 years younger than I was, and so he came to me. And because there's age groups in all those races, as you know, and sometimes it's 5 or sometimes 10 years. So he came to me and he said, "Next year I am going to beat you because I'm going to be in the same age group you are." I thought, "You are not going to beat me. That's all." So it would come to races like we'd run the Set-in-a-My race, that 20-miler from Madison to Stoughton, and I'd do all kinds of things like. We'd start out, I'd see him up ahead. I would memorize what he was wearing so that I could spot him. And then there'd be a group of 5, and I'd get on the outside and see him where he couldn't see me, and I'd sneak by him and get by, and then he'd wonder, where the heck, he'd get to the end. He said, "How did you get past me? I thought I had you." But then one year, I ran that Set-in-a-My race, and that was a grueling race. And so a couple weeks later, there was a race in Reedsburg that was called the Run for the Butter. And I thought, I'm going to go run that Run for the Butter, even though I'm still kind of in pain and stuff from the Set-in-a-My race, because I won't know anybody, so it's not going to make any difference. So I go up there and I get to the starting line, and I'm looking around. I don't know anybody. Oh, yeah, this is good. And then, like 1 minute or 2 minutes before the race is supposed to start, he steps out on the scene, and I thought, oh, no. So he took off. He hadn't run that set in May, so he took off, and his legs were fresh. And he got, probably quarter of a mile ahead of me because I just did not I couldn't hang with him at the start. My legs were. So we're about it was a 10K. We're about halfway through that 10K, and I thought, well, I guess today I'm going to lose to him. And then I thought, if I cut the distance in half from now until we get to the 1 mile out, then I could cut it. I'd have a shot at getting him in that last mile. And we got down, it came into Reedsburg, and there's like 4 blocks left. And I was right behind him. And I knew that if I passed him, I had to do it in a very positive fashion. Because if I didn't, he was going to come back at me, and I was going to have nothing left for him.
Yeah.
So there was about 3 blocks, and I got him on a corner where we turned on a street. I cut on the inside and got by him, and I beat him, and he came back at me after the race, and he said, "Boy," he said, "you were really strong at the finish there." I'm thinking, you don't know how beat I was, how much this was taking to get by you, but that was just the type of competitive person that I am.
Oh, that's awesome. I didn't realize your marathon running went that deep. So that is cool to know.
I figure I ran when I was training and running marathons. I ran 70,000 miles because I kept a log of all the miles that I ran. And
that's a lot of miles on the joints.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I can understand when you say you wore the bottom half out.
I did. So anyway.
Yeah. The marathon running, that is sure cool. Just kind of a couple real quick questions that I kind of have.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite prayer or a favorite quote that really resonates with you that you think about often?
Yes, I have one. I have some that I say every morning, but I have one that's especially important to me. It's a prayer to Our Lady of Lourdes. If you're familiar with Lourdes, there have been 70 miracles. Lourdes is in France, and there have been 70 miracles that have taken place at Lourdes that are declared such by doctors and by religious people. Mm-hmm. So it's not just religious people saying, this is a miracle.
Yep.
There's doctors who are saying there's no way this could have happened except it was a miracle. And so that's what every morning I say that prayer because, as you can imagine, there are a lot of people that have serious illnesses or they have been in an accident or something like that, and so that's a favorite prayer of mine because it asks the Blessed Mother to intercede with Christ and to bring about healing, and that's one of my favorite prayers. There are a couple of others that there are like 2 prayers that I say to the Holy Spirit that I say them every day. One of them is to me it's important because it sort of gives you a way to start the day by asking the Holy Spirit to be with you at the beginning of whatever you're going to be doing. If it's writing or if it's, traveling to a racetrack or something like this, then, also to be with you as you're completing whatever the mission is and then to bring it to a successful completion. And I find that the people, for the most part, really don't pray that much to the Holy Spirit. But the Holy Spirit, for me, is a very, very important figure in my life. Just because I think often of how in Mark's gospel, Mark says that when Christ rose and ascended into heaven, that time period between when he ascended and then when he comes back again is a time when the Holy Spirit is very active. And so, that's something that, to me, motivates why I think the Holy Spirit is so important. I'll have to talk to you, too, sometime about, I've am developing a shrine that was an old shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe, and I've got another shrine that I built to Our Lady of Lourdes. I've got another one that I built to South American martyrs. But part of that is developed around, if you go to the St. John Lateran's church in Rome, there's a place where there are what are said to be the 28 steps, they're marble, that Christ took on his way up to be in front of Pontius Pilate.
Okay.
And there's a prayer form that goes with that and people who go there kneel and do it on their knees. But then there's a little short one-sentence prayer that goes with each of the steps.
Okay.
And I say a part of that every morning. And I've developed, in this shrine, I've developed a thing where people can actually do all 28 of those little one-sentence prayers.
Okay.
But, then the other things would be, I have a prayer, it's an anointing, really, and it goes like, by the power of the, be sealed with the sign of the cross, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. And by the power of the cross, may you be protected and delivered from all evil. And may the blessings of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come upon you and remain with you forever. Amen. And I use that prayer. That's one of the prayers that I say. It's kind of it gives me a point of sort of dedication for that day, how that day is going to be lived. But I use it a lot of times with people, too, because it's in that center part of it is that idea of being protected from all evil and from all danger. And I find that that's important.
Yeah, I think especially forever, but especially in today's world, being protected against evil is a very, very real thing a lot of the time. So it's, those are great things I'm definitely going to keep in mind. So I appreciate you sharing those. So you have those prayers in the morning now. Needing to stay as active as you are, what is kind of a normal morning, kind of normal day look like for Father Grubba?
A normal day. There are no normal days, but they're all filled. I start out with my morning prayer right away, actually before I get up and get out of bed, and that's about a half hour. Then, like right now, say today, I went and said Mass. I have my own chapel. I built my own chapel, so I have a place where I can say Mass for myself on a daily basis and pray, but also where people can come if I don't have something going on somewhere else. So then after that, because I was coming up here, I went out and hand cycled indoors. I've got one set up indoors because I wanted to get some time in because I'm preparing for a virtual marathon in 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then, like, this afternoon gets filled with being here, and I'll probably go back and do a little writing, preparing for a sermon tonight. I usually end the day about 7 o'clock at night.
Okay.
That's usual. And then other days, it's varied because if I help out in a lot of different parishes, and some of them are quite a ways away. Like I'm in Mauston. I should say I live in Westfield, which is south of Stevens Point. But then I've got a little 3-room house that I and another guy built because I love doing woodworking.
Okay.
And I did all the cabinetry in the house, and I did the cabinetry in the church too. I took the MATC in Madison had a cabinet making class, and it was the greatest class there was because they had these tools like you couldn't believe,
Sure.
$50,000 sanders and things like that. So I signed up for that class 34 years in a row, and there were a number of other guys that were in there a long time too. And the instructor had the easiest job in the world because he would come in, turn on the dust collectors, and then he would say to us, "Okay, this is the only thing I have to say to you. I don't want to see any blood. Now go to work." And, I got so that like the last project before the pandemic, they closed that down with the pandemic. I was really saddened by that. But the last thing that I did was I made a Ford Woody, a life-size Ford wood body.
Really?
Like,
Okay.
remember the old Woodies with the surfboards on them?
Yep.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like that. Now, the thing I've got to do is I've got to find some race engineer or a frame builder to build a frame for the thing underneath. And then I've got an old 331 Hemi engine out of an old DeSoto that I've had forever that I want to have rebuilt and put in that. I was going to have, you're wearing a Carl Wagner shirt. Carl was a real deep friend of mine, and I was going to have him do it, but I'll probably still try to get Wagner's to do that.
I'm sure Casey and them guys would love to do that for you.
Yeah, but Carl was a great person. He didn't live too far from me, and he would come to my church, and Carl, as you know, was very outspoken, and he wasn't afraid. He'd sit in the back row of the church, and he would do things like yell out, "Grubba, it's time to get started," and all these little old ladies would go like, "Who's that? What's he doing talking to a priest like that?" But Carl, I love Carl. But I always told him, "Look, Carl, I'll ride with you," because he would always want me to go with him if there was something that happened in his life that was serious. I was always the person that had to go with him to the hospital to visit somebody or something like that. So I would tell him, "I'll go with you as long as the roads are dry, but I am not going with you if it's snowing, because and I will not ride with you on your birthday, because he had the most horrendous accidents on his birthday, and so that was always part of it. And then I'd tell him, and I'd say, "Carl, you're in the top 5 friends I have." And he'd look at me and say, "You got a really poor choice of friends." But just to tell one of the stories about his birthday, well, he had an old like 54 Chevy pickup truck.
Okay.
And it was dead of winter. Snowbanks were really high, and he was going to deliver 4 or 5 motors, and he had them just in the back of the truck. He didn't have them tied down or anything. So he's coming down, and there's this intersection, and this lady pulls out from behind the snowbank, and she's right in the center of the road. And Carl knows that she just stopped. She just froze when she saw him coming. I mean, Carl probably was driving a little bit fast, too. So Carl knew that if he hit her, he'd kill her because he'd be right in the driver's door. So he went up over the snowbank, and then the trucks flipped over a couple of times. The motors went all over the place. And then he bounced back, and he came down on the road right where the lady was, where she had stopped, right by her. And you know how strong Carl was. The truck is teetering up and back and forth on its roof.
Yeah.
And Carl just flips it up and over on its wheels again. And of course, she was just petrified. She's thinking, and there was a farmer came along with a tractor and a manure spreader at the time. And this lady saying to him, he's going to kill me. He's going to kill me. I know he's going to kill me. So anyway, they finally got the whole thing straightened out. Next morning, Carl goes down to the grocery store, and he goes to the deli, and lo and behold, who's in the deli with a tray of donuts but this lady? And she sees Carl, and she flips the donuts up in the air, takes off on a run into a back room where he can't get at her. But that was one of the instances. Another instance on his birthday, this was when he was young. He had his dad's brand new Ford Fairlane. And he comes to an intersection, and he sees coming from this other direction, he sees a dump truck has stopped. And the guys in the dump truck are looking at him, but they've got their hands over their eyes. And he thinks, what's this all about? And then he switches back, and here's a semi coming straight at him with a load of potatoes. And Carl had the presence of mind to open the door of the car and get out. And he's standing there. The guy with the load of potatoes hits the car and spins the car up into the air and leaves Carl just standing right there. And that was why Carl never wore a seatbelt, because he always figured if he'd had a seatbelt on, he'd got killed. The car goes up in the air, spins, and it goes right into the side of the semi. So now there's potatoes all over the place. But then he had to call his dad and say, Dad, your new Ford Fairlane, it is no more. But you never rode with Carl on his birthday.
I never heard anyone else say it, but I think I might be a little careful on my own birthday now, too.
Okay.
No, always a joy to hear a good Carl Wagner story. That is for sure. So where did you grow up? You're in Westfield now, but where did you grow up?
I grew up, my dad owned a farm about 10 miles north of Portage, between Endeavor and Briggsville. And like all those farms at that time, they were 140 acres. You had probably 14, 15 cows, and it was a regular dairy farm. And then my mother was a school teacher, and she taught she ended up for most of her years teaching in the Portage school system at an outlying school called Lewiston. And she ended up not only being teacher there, but being the principal there, too.
Okay.
So that was sort of my background. And then I went, at that time, like my first 8 years of grade school, I went to a small country school, and it was just one of those small white buildings, and we had, I think most of the time, about 14 kids in it.
Okay.
I think I had one classmate. And there'd be some places where there wasn't a grade, there weren't any kids. Mm-hmm. But I really enjoyed, that start. And then I went on from there to graduated from grade school and went into the seminary, and was in Madison for, I think, 6 years at Queen of Apostles, and then from there on to St. Francis and for 2, and then I went out to Catholic University in Washington, D.C. for 4 years. I did my theology out there, but I also, at the same time, studied and earned my master's degree in American history.
Okay.
And then I came back from there and taught in the seminary for 13 years, I think, besides helping out in other parishes. But I enjoyed farm life. I think there were 2 things that happened in that period of time that were going to have an influence on me that would be a lifelong influence. One of them was, if you lived on a farm in those days, you were going to work, because you were going to hay and you were going to do all of the things that went with farming. And your dad expected that you were going to do that. The other thing was then probably, I think back, I worked for 10 years at a place called Dairyland Poultry, which was a poultry processing plant, and it was in a nearby town of Endeavor. And I, one summer, for instance, I went every week. There wasn't a week that I didn't work 70 hours, and the way at that time, my wages probably were, when I started, 95 cents an hour, probably grew up to, by the time I left, $1.23 or something. But the thing was, you had to be in overtime by Wednesday, or it was going to be a bad week, because overtime paid time and a half.
Right.
So $2. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
But it was that between farming, and it was that commitment to putting in those hours that gave me the work ethic that I still have to this day. If I sit for a half hour, I start to get nervous about what should I be doing.
Yeah.
I should be writing, or I should be off to a race, or should be doing something.
Right.
But it's just, I guess it was just those years that sort of formed my life in a way that was lasting.
Yeah. I mean, between farming and working 70 hours a week at the poultry plant, that's some work ethic there for sure, especially when you're in overtime by Wednesday.
Yeah. And this again, there was one other lesson that came out of that whole thing. And when I think back, I couldn't have been maybe have had my driver's license for a year, but remember, I was gone in the seminary, so I didn't drive except during the summer when I was going back and forth to work. So one night, the boss at Dairyland Poultry said his worker, the guy that was supposed to, because you went out and you got a semi-load of chickens at night, because you couldn't catch them during the day because they'd all run down to the end of the chicken house and smother. Okay. So you had to go in there in the dark, and so that was what let me accumulate all those hours, because I'd drive all night from wherever I was going. Okay. And start out in the morning and work until it was time to drive again. I tell young people this all the time. One night, and I would guess that I probably had my driver's license a year. One night, the boss, the person that was supposed to take a semi out and get a load of chickens didn't show up. And the boss walks me out in the yard, and we're looking at this semi. And he says to me, "Do you think you can drive that?" And I said, "Yeah, I think I can drive that." And so I did, and then that opened up the door to a lot of extra time work, Sure. But also, I really enjoyed, if you're a young kid, you can imagine your son, if he was maybe 15 years older, and all of a sudden, he's going to be driving a semi down the road with all these other semi guys on the CBs and all that stuff. It was a wild experience. It's thrilling. It really was. Yeah. But if I had said, no, I don't think I can drive that, I would have turned down, first of all, the opportunity for all that overtime. But I also would have turned down something that I really, really enjoyed doing as a young man. I think about it often. I don't think I would have wanted to be a semi driver for my whole career. Mm-hmm. But it certainly was fun when you were young and you were on the road and you had this great 18-wheeler and you were learning how to back the thing up to a loading dock and all the stuff that went with it. But yeah, so but that was my start in life. It was pretty much like that.
Okay. And how were your parents growing up? What were they like? As figures to you? Were they very religious? Because obviously you end up going
Yeah.
into the seminary. How was religious life growing up?
Yeah, they were. We were members of a small parish called St. Mary's in Briggsville, and my parents, practiced the faith, and I'm sure when you think about where did I get started as a priest or thinking about being a priest, I'm sure that it came, from my parents.
Okay.
I often laugh about when I was young. I don't know how old I was. Maybe first, second grade, something like that. Maybe a little older. I would play being a priest at home. I'd have my altar set up, and I have one brother. I'd make him be the congregation, so he had to sit there while I preached to him and did things like that.
No kidding.
But that was the kind of the start of the whole thing, and then it just went from there to being in the seminary, and I always had a desire just to work with people, and I think that was what drew me into the priesthood, was being able to be with people, share life with them, share their good times, share their bad times, and probably be able to just sit and listen to them when there were bad times. But when I think about it, if you had asked me right at the start of my priesthood what I would be doing as a priest, it wouldn't be a clue, because it just took off in different directions. And probably there again, maybe it was just the idea of being open to challenges, but the whole idea of being in auto racing came about. Howard Johnson and Jerry Benson, who owned the Dells Speedway, asked me if I would do invocations, and I think I'd been ordained 1 year, so it was like 1967, and the thing is, I always say my interest in auto racing started in 1963. Because that was when I wrote down who won the races that I went to the Dells. That was the speedway that I started out at, and I kept a record of who won on the nights that I went, and that came about in a strange way. I had a friend in this one-room school. I had a friend by the name of Bill Manthe. And we had stayed in touch, and it was probably about 3 years from being ordained. And he said, you got to go over to the Dells and go to the races. He says, you won't believe what's going on over there. And he became a big Richard Petty fan, and so I went over, and sure enough, it was exciting, and I got hooked on the whole thing, and that was the start. That was the start of it. So then, a year after I had been ordained, when Benson and Johnson approached me and asked if I wanted to do invocations, it was sort of a natural thing to do. And at that time at the Dells, it was a quarter-mile track, and the judges' stand and the announcers' stand was down in the infield, as were the pits.
Okay.
And so what happened was I would do the invocation, and then I just hung around, and Trickle and Reffner and all these guys who were there. And so pretty soon I became very close friends with them. And then what happened was Sam Bardis, when he heard that I was doing the invocations at the Dells, And you have to remember, there wasn't anybody doing that at all.
Okay.
I was the first to do invocation.
Interesting. Okay, I did not know that.
Yeah. So when Sam Bartis heard about it, then he said, well, you're traveling all the way up to the Dells on Saturday night. Why don't you come over to Capitol Speedway? The seminary is only about 15 miles away. So then I started doing the invocations there. And then, of course, Sam owned Golden Sands at the time.
Yep.
So pretty soon, and see, I was teaching, so I was relatively free during the summer. I'd go to the university for classes. But, so it grew into a whole kind of schedule of being at races probably 3 or 4 nights a week, because Tuesdays would be specials. And then I would be at the Dells, Golden Sands, and then also at Capitol Speedway on Friday night, and then that just grew. But if you had asked me if I was going to be doing all that stuff, I would have said no. And the reason, like I can tell you now, when I was in Washington, D.C., where I was going to school, it was really strict at that time. You could not, we stayed at a place, it was a priest run dorm called Theological College.
Okay.
And you could go anywhere. You were there. That was it. And you went to classes, came back to the building. Well, I thought to myself, I'm never going to go to a NASCAR race, because at that time that was a southeastern sport.
Mm-hmm.
And they went to New York a little bit but that was it. So I thought, if I'm going to go to a race, I've got to go now while I'm in my final year at Theological College. I've got to go now, or I'm never going to see a NASCAR race. So I set it all up where in the morning we had morning prayers, and we walked outside in a little garden area that we had. So I went out there. I had my own car. I walked out, and then I just walked down the street to where my car was parked and took off for Rockingham. And I stayed overnight. I slept in my car behind a gas station, and I bought a ticket from a guy that was at the gas station and went to my race. And then I drove back and walked in during the evening prayer where you could walk around outside.
Okay.
And never got caught. But if I'd have got caught, I probably would have got kicked out of the priesthood, seminary at the time. But then that started. As soon as other students saw that I could do it, then all of a sudden other people began to do it. Pretty soon they changed the rule. But that was my first experience. And then it worked so well that I went to Martinsville that same year.
Okay.
And then came back and was ordained in 66 in June. But that was sort of the start I never thought that I'd go to a NASCAR race, and if you had told me how involved I was going to be in racing or even NASCAR even, I'd have just said no, that isn't going to happen. But there were things again. And things happen, I guess, in your life that open doors. But, there were 3 people that really opened doors for me when it came to NASCAR, because you have to remember, it was a southeastern sport. Mm-hmm. And at that time, if somebody didn't say, this guy's okay, like if Earnhardt was here, and if somebody didn't turn and say, this guy is okay, Earnhardt wasn't going to give you the time of day. So you had to have somebody that would give you the time of the day. And the person that did, first of all, was Bobby Allison. And Allison was racing up here quite a bit, and at Wausau and Kaukauna and places like that. And I always remember the first night that I was with him. At that time I had started writing for Checkered Flag, and I thought I'll go up and interview him and do an article for Checkered Flag. So I went up, and there weren't a lot of people. We're doing a thing at a auto dealership. There weren't a lot of people around, so we had a real chance to talk. And then we went out to the races, and it's about 10:30 at night or 11, whatever it was, when the racing got done. And Bobby says, "Come over here." I got, oh, man. He's going to chew me out for being a priest and being out here late at night. And he said, "No, I want to go to confession." So, we went to confession, and that started a real strong relationship.
Yeah.
Then I met, and I don't remember anymore how I met. It might have been Bobby that introduced me to Humpy Wheeler, who was the promoter at Charlotte Speedway. But Humpy also just opened a tremendous amount of doors, and he would invite me down for his race weekends, and I would be in his office the whole weekend and be with him if I wasn't doing photography or doing interviews, things like that.
Okay.
And then, that led to his doing invocations at Charlotte Motor Speedway and just different things that he wanted me to do, like Joe Whitlock's funeral and a few things. But that was the second person that really opened doors. And the other person that really opened a lot of doors was Bill Broderick, who was the PR person for Union Oil at the time.
Okay.
And he opened doors. He helped a lot of people. But those three people pretty much paved the way for me. And then, of course, Dick Berggren at Stock Car Racing Magazine, because Stock Car Racing Magazine was the magazine in those days.
Yeah.
If you wrote for Stock Car Racing Magazine, you
grew up reading them.
Yeah, you had reason to be happy and proud. And I remember I had been writing for Checkered Flag, and all of a sudden I thought, well, I'm going to try and make the jump from the local racing paper to Stock Car Racing Magazine. So I wrote an article and sent it in. And Dick sent it back, and he said, you're just using too highfalutin words. You got to get down on a different level completely. And Dick Trickle said the same thing. He said, we don't understand those words you're writing. You got to get this much simpler. But that started a whole career in photography and in racing. Because, see, in those days, like if you were out here, and my first article was on Jimmy Bach, but they weren't going to send a photographer out here to do photos of Jimmy Bach. So you had to be able to do the illustrations as well as write the article.
Okay.
And, so that really helped. The fact that I could do both just brought about a whole writing career. And, I still talk to Dick in fact, I talked to him probably about 2 weeks ago. One of the things that I think about a lot is with these people is, they had such an influence on my life that I never want to take that for granted. So, like in December, when we would have the Alan Kowicki banquet, and I'd go down because I'm on the board of directors for that thing.
Okay.
I would always make it a point of getting Bobby and Humpy together, and we'd go out for lunch, because I always wanted to be able to say that I had stayed in contact with them, thinking, sooner or later one of us is going to be gone.
Mm-hmm.
I'll be gone at my age, and they're about the same age as I am, or one of them, and sure enough, Bobby is gone now. But so that was always very important to me. And I've got to get back and see Dick Berggren too, because, he again just opened up that whole world of race writing on a national level. And then, of course, from there, it went into the challenge of writing books. And toward the end, what happened was big organizations began to take over the whole scene, like Getty, for instance, with photography, would bring like 6 or 8 photographers to Daytona.
Okay.
And it became the age of digital thing. So they would have their photographers out on the track, but then they would have people in the media center who would be processing all of this stuff and sending it out. And it got so you couldn't compete if you were a freelancer like me.
Okay, makes sense. Yeah.
Because you'd have to shoot your own pictures, bring them in, and then process them and send them out. And all that works pretty much on a first come, first served basis, especially in newspapers and things of that nature. So then what I decided to do was I wanted to make sure that we preserved the history of racing in Wisconsin. And so I put together a book on the Milwaukee Modifieds, because there was a great era of racing there that was from about it would have been in the 70s. And it was as strong at that time as the Central Wisconsin circuit became. And then, of course, so I wanted to do that book because a lot of those drivers like Fuzzy Fosbender and people like that were still alive. So I had the chance to interview them and then do a profile on them. And sure enough, now if I wanted to do it, I couldn't, because many of them have passed away.
Yeah.
And so I did that book, and then I set out, I wanted to do the 67, and again, capture all of Central Wisconsin racing. And so those two are, and then I did a biography of Alan Kowicki. I had known him quite well and had been involved in his life. And so those 3 books kind of stand out as the books, even though I've written other books. But so what happened was, times changed, and you had to change yourself if you were going to remain viable.
Right.
I'm glad now that for instance, I had a chance to interview Tom and really put together that whole year that he had where he won the 67 features. And it was interesting how, in interviewing him, you got a lot of insights. And Dee Dee, of course, was always with him. One of the things I think he admired was you never saw the 2 of them separate from each other.
Nope.
You always saw them together. And she was the one that kept all the notes. So I had the privilege of having the notes that they had taken, from each race, because that's what she did, to put into the book. But if I did another one, if I did a final one, it would be called 2 Dreams and 1 Championship, and it would be when Robbie Reiser started out racing and Matt Kenseth started out racing, and then how they got together, and formed a team and won the championship. And then I would stop the book maybe the year after that, so like 2004 or something.
Okay.
But that's
maybe something we could see from you at some point.
Yeah, I think so. I should get started. I've been the last year or 2 because of retiring and everything has changed. Just trying to get settled in again. But I'm beginning to feel like I've got time I can set aside now to do that.
Okay. The one thing I wanted to comment on, going all the way back to when you snuck off campus to go to Rockingham, you can definitely tell racing had snuck in your blood at that point, because that's definitely something a racer would do.
Yeah, they would. Definitely would.
The one thing I wanted to, going all the way back to kind of your call to the priesthood, just because I went to Catholic schools my whole life, and I had two teachers, I think, that went into this that were went to be a nun at some point, and I always remember them telling their stories of whether it was a dream or something that they had, that that all these different things added up, that where they really felt, hey, I think this is my sign from God that I need to follow this path. Did you have anything like that ended up being like, hey, I've had this strong pull, but I had this happen that really said, hey, this is God telling me to do this?
I think, I started out with just the initial thought of doing it. But I think with me, the further I got down the road, the stronger the desire felt, And I look back now, and I say to myself, I couldn't have had a different vocation or a different career that would have been more enjoyable than the career that I've had. And I really, in many ways, have been blessed by God. I just think that I think that because I chose it and because I tried to live it, in turn, the blessings were there from doing that. But I think for me, it probably worked a little bit in reverse.
Okay.
In the sense that, and part of it is the kind of the game I play with myself. When I retired, I didn't really want to retire, but things were just going in a different direction. And so then I had to make up, okay, am I going to just sit in a room and watch television the rest of my life, or what am I going to do? And so I decided that one of the things that I wanted to do was get out into different parishes and do weekend help outs.
Okay.
So I devised this whole program, and it's called, I didn't bring any of my business cards, but it's like, have chalice will travel. Remember the old Paladin movie? No, you're too young.
I don't remember that.
You don't remember that. Well, along with Gunsmoke. I think it came on.
Gunsmoke, I do know.
I think it came on after Gunsmoke.
Okay.
But it was Paladin, and he had the slogan was, have gun will travel.
Okay.
And so he had a business card with it had a chess piece on it. But so I changed it, and it's have chalice will travel, and I have all my in contact information on it. But as a result, I've been all over the place. I've been to places like it's fun because I didn't even. It's kind of like doing a travel log of different places in Wisconsin, like. At Mauston, obviously, I've been in and a number of places, but I didn't even know there was a Cashton, or I didn't know that there was a Norwalk, up by La Crosse.
Okay.
Until, they called me and asked me if I would come up and help out, because with the shortage of priests, if a priest wants to take a vacation, he's got to try and find somebody to fill in for him for the weekend. So it's, all of it, So I kind of am filling in, and at the same time, it gives me value, gives me purpose, and it gives me a sense of value. I spent like 7 weeks, I think, up in Hurley, and I'm going up to Bessemer in Michigan, and I got a call from a pastor. I got to wait to see how this is going to work, because I told him I wouldn't come if it was snowing, because it's 4.5 hours up along Lake Michigan,
okay,
up at the northern end of Lake Michigan. But I was thinking about that. I thought, if Francis Xavier could make it all the way to China without an airplane or without a car, I think I can make it up to the northern end of Lake Michigan.
Yeah.
So, but it's become a real kind of adventure for me to get to some of these parishes, and I find all kinds of really neat people, and just I take pictures of it because I have my own Facebook page, my own YouTube. Father Dale Grubba and Friends. So when I go to these churches, I take pictures of the churches and the stained glass windows and all that, and then post it. And it's really neat. And people love seeing what some of these other churches look like.
Yeah.
I had never, for instance, and you've probably been there 101 times. I'd never been in Rochelle. I didn't even. And I go to Rochelle, and it was they were going. I had to read an announcement about their fall festival.
Okay.
And they were having a kielbasa, and I go like, I've been a priest for 58 years. I never saw a church picnic with kielbasa on it.
Yeah, that's Polish. Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, when it came time for the festival, a guy actually called me up. He said, "I'm bringing you down some kielbasa." I said, "You don't have to do that," but he did.
Okay.
So there's a certain sense of excitement just in getting out and seeing other people. And this is kind of a side product of it, but in our day and our age, you can get so kind of out of focus by watching whatever's on television.
Yeah, certainly.
Television news. And you just get the thought sometimes that, we're going to hell in a handbasket. But like one of the things that happened that had a great impact on me in the last year, when I went to Norwalk, there was a young lady, Zeta Carpenter, and she had learned how to play the organ, and she was very good. And a senior in high school, and she had gotten some of her classmates, and they formed a little choir, and just to be in contact with her and see just a wonderful young lady, and then the next thing was the shrine that I'm developing. We had the Greg McCarnes, who's the promoter. His son Alan goes to La Crosse University.
Okay.
And so he called me up and he said, we think we should be doing something besides sitting around drinking beer all weekend. I've got about 15, 16 gals, and we'd like to come down and do a project at your shrine that you're doing. And so they came down and loaded all this lumber that I had that's being turned into flooring for the shrine, and they were just wonderful young people, just great people, and then I sponsored a ballet group of young ladies that performed at Watoma at the Performing Arts Center, and again just beautiful young people. And then, of course, I'm part of the Alan Kowicki thing, where that driver development program, and you end up with 7 drivers that compete during the summer. And again, just wonderful young men. And so if I had just sat in a room watching The Price is Right or something boring like that, I never would have had that experience of being with, these young people, and just seeing, that there is hope for the church for the future, but there's also hope for our country for the future too, if these people come into control, and if we foster them and encourage them, to be and to be leaders, because they're certainly there, and so that was one of the great benefits of the past year, and a switch kind of in what I'm doing. And another thing I think sometimes too, if you've been working towards things, then at the end of your career, everything kind of comes together. You know, like I look at the racing and the involvement that I have. I was doing Wausau Speedway and Invocations and Golden Sands, and then down at Sun Prairie, and then all of the other specials, you know, the Slinger Nationals and the Dick Trickle 99, and the two ones that were for your grandpa, you know, one at La Crosse and the other one at Golden Sands.
Yep.
So, you know, it's kind of a culmination of all the effort that you've put in, but it gives you a great sense of satisfaction, you know, to still be able to do those things.
Yeah.
And to be able to be there and honor those people who are such a big part of your life.
Yeah, no, that it definitely sounds like you stay busy, and yeah, I think, you know, it's a really, you know, really good point. You know, yeah, if a person does get caught up in the news nowadays, it is very easy to, you know, to feel down on, you know, maybe where the world is, where the country is, but when you really go out there and look, there's a lot of great young men and women out there and doing a lot of great things.
See, and the other thing that took place, there was a shrine. See, when I was growing up, we had a lot of migrant workers working on the marsh farms in the Portage area, because they were raising vegetables, and these migrant people were there to grow the crops, the lettuce, a lot of it was, and other vegetables, but at the same then harvest them. So there was a mission that the Diocese of Madison had set up called Our Lady of Guadalupe in Endeavor, and it served two purposes. It was a religious, you know, a place for going to mass, but also there was a school there, and then the Dominican nuns who were off during the summer would go up there and teach the kids, and not just religion, but try to bring them up, because they were so transitory, try to catch them up on reading and math and things of that nature. And I drove the school bus for those, as well as other things I was doing. I drove the school bus for those kids, and there were two things I just remember about driving the school bus, and one was this one marsh farm had a long driveway, and the culvert had collapsed in the driveway. So you had to be very careful, because there was that dip.
Okay.
And you just eased your bus through the dip, or you were going to come off the ground. Well, one morning I was so tired, I forgot about it, and I hit it with the front wheel at full speed, and the front end of the bus came up, and I came out of the driver's seat. And I'm holding on to the steering wheel like this, out of the seat.
Yeah.
I look in the rearview mirror, and then the rear wheels hit, and all the kids bounced up out of the seats and back down. I think they thought that was the greatest carnival ride we ever had.
I bet you're awake after that one.
I was awake after that. They were awake too.
Yeah.
But there was another time. I probably shouldn't tell the story, but there was another time where. I had all the kids in the bus, and we're pulling up to the school, and probably about 4 or 5 blocks away, and Louis, I don't know for sake of a name, Louis is coming up the aisle, and he's crying like, "Ooh." I go like, what did Louis? What's this going on? So he gets right up beside me, and he says, "Pedro hit me." I said, "You go back and you slug Pedro right in the nose." So he turns and he's all the way back. Wham! He slugs Pedro. Now, both of them are crying. I let him off the bus and let the nuns handle that one.
It's either get it from Louis or get it from the nuns.
Yeah, it was one or the other. Oh, boy. But see, then to end that story, Uh, Times changed, and so there wasn't a need for migrant workers anymore. And so the place fell into ill repair, and the diocese gave it away to a group in Endeavor that used it as a community center for a while. Then they built their own community center, so it really fell into ill repair. And the center of the whole thing was a mosaic that was 7 feet wide. It was an outdoor thing, but 7 feet wide and about 14 feet high.
Okay.
And it had 2 towers on either side of it. And it was kind of like one of those bathtubs that you see with the Blessed Mother in it.
Yep.
So the mosaic sat in that there. And these 2 nuns had done this mosaic. And they were both about 20. They were the same age as I was. They were both about 25, 24. And they didn't have any money. So they would go to like taverns and get beer bottles and whiskey bottles and break them up for the browns.
Okay.
And then stick those pieces of glass in the mosaic. And then when it came to blues, Noxzema was in glass bottles at the time. They'd bust up Noxzema bottles. And then greens were Squirt and 7-Up. And you can still, if you go up close to the mosaic, you can see the emblems from Squirt or whatever
that's cool.
in there. And then at that time, taillights in cars were glass, so they'd go out to junkyards and break taillights out of the cars for their reds.
Sure.
Well, that shrine was still in existence about 4 or 5 years ago, but it was all overgrown with bushes and whatnot. Most people didn't even realize it was there. In fact, people in Endeavor didn't realize it was there. So finally, this group that owned it thought, who could we get to restore that thing before it falls down? And they thought, Grubba used to live around here. I'll bet you if we approach him, he'd do something. So they got in touch with me, and they said, they owed back taxes 3 years, so that probably was some part of the equation too. So they came to me and they said, would you be willing to restore this thing? We'll give you the title of the deed to the property if you'll make an attempt to restore it. So I thought, yeah, I guess I can try. And then I looked around and I thought, holy man, what did I get myself into? This is because what had happened was that shrine structure was made out of cement block, but it wasn't made out of the good cement block. It was made out of some porous kind of cement.
Okay.
And then water got down in the core's holes of this. And when it froze in the winter, it popped the backs off all the cement blocks. So the whole thing, and there was a dome on it that had remained intact. So the weight of the dome was about to crush the whole thing down. So the first thing that I had to do was to rescue that. And I found a person, what happened, John Van Wee, who owned Dell's Lumberyard, I had worked with him on some projects, and I asked him if he would take a look at this project and see what he thought. And he came out, and we talked about it, and he stayed, and I left for another commitment, and he put his crutch, because he was going to get a knee replacement, and he was really in bad shape, and he was using crutches at the time. But he put his crutch up on the mosaic, and he said, if I don't want a miracle for myself, but I'm going to help Father Grubba restore this thing. Well, then he went home, and he left his crutches in the garage, and his wife said, where are your crutches? And he said, I don't need them anymore. I can walk. And then he went to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, aren't you in any pain? And John said, no. So why are we going to do the surgery? So they never did the surgery. And John would go, like he did a trip in Europe, and he walked 4 or 5 miles a day, and nothing. But then what happened was John put me in touch with other people. Then we raised $86,000 to restore this shrine because we had to put iron beams in the back.
Okay.
And then we put cement around that. And then we built another cement block wall and poured cement down in between to stabilize the whole thing. And then we found out that the mosaic on the front side was about pulled away from the blocks by about that far, so we had to drill a lot of holes, pump epoxy in to glue it back together. But the whole thing, and I'm just convinced it's the Blessed Mother and Christ that wants this done, because anytime, I just say I'm along for the ride on this one. We got that 96,000 right from Tom Luke over at Wilderness Resort in the Dells. And then a young couple from Florida that I knew from my parish work at Neshgoro came in and they financed the building of a shrine to Our Lady of Lourdes, and then another one to South American Martyrs. And then they helped me restore the sanctuary in the church, because there's a church and a side thing that was used for a school there also. And then Tom Luke came back and engineered and was responsible for the financing of a huge landscaping project.
Okay.
Probably like $1.3 million. And it's just, you can't believe it. We planted 4,800 trees and bushes and flowers, and it's got sidewalks in it, and it's got lights along the sidewalks and lights in the shrines now. So that has kind of has really absorbed a lot of my time. This summer I was out there just because we had 8 companies working on the thing during the summer.
Wow.
But it's very impressive. It is.
Yeah, it sure sounds like it.
I look at all those lights and I think we're going to have an airplane land in here by mistake.
Yeah, yeah.
But I'm excited about it. But I guess I'm most excited about it because I think when people come out there, the first thing they say is "wow," and and maybe it'll have a revival of faith in people as a result of experiencing it. But we've got quite a bit to do yet. We put windows in. I had another person, Kent Walbeck, gave me $96,000, and we put new windows in the church itself. But we've got the front of the church to do. And see, the trouble is, now that the surroundings, the grounds are like that wow effect, you got the front of the church has to have a wow effect also, so that people say, "Oh, I got to stop and look at that,"
Mm-hmm.
And so the pressure is on.
Yeah. No, well, if I find myself that way, I'll have to make the effort to stop in there and check that out sometime. So going back into a little bit about, racing around here. So you go to the Dells and you get hooked there, and because your friend told you should go, and that bug bit you. Where did things really take you there? In the we can touch on a little bit of. I'd love to touch on a little bit of NASCAR stuff too, but where did things really? What was it like being around all those guys in Wisconsin and the Midwest?
Well, it was fun. I think one of the things, when I think back, I say, why did Johnson and Benson want me around? What was their incentive to ask me? And I think it was because racing in those days was a pretty rough and tumble sport. And I think they thought, if we add a priest to the mix, the general public will say, well, it has to be okay because there's a priest out there every night, So I think that, but I was fortunate because I was the same age. Like Tom Reffner was the oldest in our group, and then Marv Marzofka and myself. We were all born within the same year.
Okay.
And then Dick Trickle was a year younger. So, what happened was they were in their starting, when I went to the Dells in 67, they were kind of in their starting stages too.
Yeah.
And I just grew up with them. And then,
Right.
of course, Rusty Wallace came along and Mark Martin, and it just was kind of a natural progression. And I think that was what really made the difference. But, you know, part of racing in those days was you didn't want to miss a race, because if you missed a race, there was always something that went on from when the races ended until the next morning. You know, you had like your grandpa and Jimmy Bach, who at that time had, like, they transported the race cars. They worked together as a team. They had a truck and a trailer, and they would run the car up on the trailer, and then they would move the planks from here up between the trailer and the truck, and drive for that first race car up on the truck. Well, invariably the planks would, you know, fall off, and the car would fall down in the between the two, and there was always some story.
Yeah, what a sight to see, right?
What a sight to see! Like, probably one of the classics was, you know, Johnny Ziegler and Bobby Gunn raced a lot together, and so one night at the Dells, because Capital was on Friday night, Dells was on Saturday night, so I go over to the Dells, and Johnny Ziegler's got a cast on his arm, and from his elbow down. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "We were loading the car, and the ramp slipped, and I broke my wrist." Well, anyway, I was teaching at the seminary, so one of the teachers lived in Oregon, and he came to school on Monday, and he said, "What the heck were your friends doing in downtown Oregon on Friday night?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well," he said, I think it was the Long Branch. He said, "There was this big fight that broke out, and the cops were there, and they arrested this one guy. They had him in the back of the squad car, and he jumped out and took off on the run, and so forth." So I thought, okay, well, come on, Johnny, what's going on? Well, what turned out was Johnny and Bobby Gunn both had very attractive wives. And, you know, they were in this bar, and this guy came in, and he made a pass at one of their wives. And then Johnny drop-kicked him out of the bar. Well, the guy went out, and he got 7 other guys and came back. And there's this huge fight that breaks out. And Johnny was standing on the bar. He was going to jump off on a guy. And the guy moved, and he fell on the floor and broke his wrist. That was how he broke his wrist. But then they went to St. Mary's Hospital, and they put this cast on. In those days, they were plaster.
Okay.
And so when Johnny comes down, the first thing he does is run out to the car, and that plaster was still wet enough that he could form his hand around the steering wheel, so he'd be able to drive a race car, you know, the next with that cast on. But there was always a good story that something had happened, and I think that's a lot of what's missing in this day and age. Of course, you couldn't get away with a lot of that stuff because everybody's got their cell phones, and they take pictures of all that stuff, and you know, it just in those days, you know, unless you were there, you probably didn't know that it was going on.
Right.
But you know, too, the racing was unbelievable. And you think about what those guys did, like, you know, winning 67 features, like Dick in 72, in one summer. I think he ran 105 programs. Tom in 75 coming back and winning 67 features.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal. The guys I don't think the guys run 67 programs in a year for the most part. I think they might get up in the 40s or 30s, but I think your grandpa Tom, I think he ran like 114 to 120 some programs the year that he won all of those. But you look at it and you look in the competition, see, because they were starting from the back and coming to the front, so you really had to be good because you were in a group of guys that were exceptionally good drivers. Right. It wasn't like I went to some races with Bobby Allison down south, and they would put the fast timer on the pole. Well, that was a whole different story.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're, regardless of how fast you are, just the luck and all the things that have to go right in order to come from the back to the front and make it all happen, and the thing holds together.
Laps or so.
Right.
That was another thing. You weren't running 100-lap features or 50-lap features. You were running 25 laps, and so you had to really move. And we not only had like a good crop of drivers from Wisconsin, but you had a lot of guys coming in too, like Joe Shear was very good, and he raced on the circuit a lot. But then you had other guys like Ed Howe and Tom Meyer and the Bear out of Ohio, I think, and who was 84? They called him the sleeper because he would puddle around in the back, and then all of a sudden he'd start creeping up and creeping up.
Was it a blue car?
Yeah.
I know who you're talking about. I'm trying to,
Seneker.
Okay.
Bob Seneker.
Yeah.
Yeah. As time went on, then they began to have more specials. It got so that every Tuesday night there was a special someplace. Mm-hmm. And I was surprised in writing this book. I didn't think there were that many, but it was almost every Tuesday night somewhere at Capitol Speedway or at Dell's or something like that. The thing was, like Howard Johnson and Benson would say, we didn't want Joe Shear to come, or we didn't want Ed Howe to come, except for specials, because otherwise specials weren't specials.
Sure.
Like if Joe Shear raced here every Saturday night or every Friday night, he was no longer a special driver that you were bringing in and building, and building a big show out of.
Yeah.
But it was, and then, and the thing was, like, that was why, what also was good, like Ted Musgrave and and all these other guys that came, Rusty Wallace and people like that, they came here because they knew, and that, there wasn't that, like we have now in NASCAR. You have your top division, your second division, and trucks. There was nothing. You either made it into the top division because there wasn't any other division. Mm-hmm. And that's why Dick and some of those guys didn't go down, because they were making pretty good money here.
Yeah. You definitely hear a lot about that, and I guess in speaking of Dick Trickle, someone that is so many people all around in racing, especially here in Wisconsin, love and adore. Talk a little bit about your relationship and time spent with him over the years.
Oh, it was always funny, and I think our relationship changed as time went on. But I remember probably about the third year that I was doing invocations and wondering, is this worthwhile, or am I doing anything that's worthwhile? And Dick came up and said, he said, every year we really wonder if you're coming back. We really enjoy having you here. And so that, that kind of gave me a sense of, it is, there is good reason for me being here with all these guys. But Dick was always funny. He always had certain stories that he told. And sometimes I thought, my God, if the bishop ever listened to Racing Roundup and Dick was telling these stories about me, I'd be in deep trouble. But one of the stories that he would always tell, and I tell this now when people ask me, have you retired? I always tell, Dick said to me one day, can priests retire? And he was always setting me up for something.
Yeah.
Can priests retire? And I said, yeah, we can retire at 70 if we want to. He says, well, when you retire, can you drink beer and chase women? And I said, no. He said, well, then why would you want to retire? So I always told, when people would ask, don't you want to retire? I'd tell them the Dick story.
Yeah.
But another one was, we were at Capitol Speedway on a Sunday afternoon, and it was hot. And so after the races, we're down in the pits, and I'm sitting with Dick, and Dick sees these three gals coming that were scantily dressed. And so he looks at me and he says, what does a priest think when he sees something like that? And I said, nothing. And he always repeated that on the radio, wherever it was. He would always tell that story about nothing, But another of the stories, and he always credited me with being the first person that he really told the story about. And that was, if you remember, he limped.
Yep.
And that came from when he was a child. And they used to play BB gun tag. The only rule was you couldn't shoot a person in the head. But you could shoot them every place else. But anyway, they're in this building that was being built. And it was it was like open floors. There were just the joists there,
Okay.
2x6s and stuff. And they were playing tag up there, and he fell from the second floor down through the first floor and into the basement. And the other kids got scared, so they ran off and left him there. And he landed on his hip and destroyed his hip. And then he had a long period of rehabbing from that. And the doctors told him that he would never walk again. But, as he said, you don't tell a young person that they're never going to walk again. Mm-hmm. So, he learned to walk, but he had a struggle, with that whole thing for a long period of time.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And that was where that limp came from. But he would talk about how he went to the Catholic school in grade school at Rudolph, and they would bring him his lunch because he would be sitting in the classroom. He couldn't go for any place else. But
yeah.
And so then I think, I often think, because I think about how, Dick, as time went on, our relationship changed, became more serious, and something I probably wouldn't have thought about doing in the beginning, because was, I'd ask him if I could give him my blessing and things like that, and he wholeheartedly agreed to that. But I think about his passing, and I just wish that he had moved back up here to Wisconsin when he retired, because I think that would have made a difference, because he would have been back with Marv Marzofka, and he would have been back with your grandpa, and he would have been able to go out to racetracks, and his whole life and his whole love was short track racing. Mm-hmm. Mark Mackesy said, he was a rock star, and Mark would say you could call him and ask him, I'm going to go and I'm going to race at Rockford. what's the setup for that? And Dick would talk about that as long as you wanted to talk. But the minute that you tried to switch to talking about NASCAR, he would just cut off the conversation, and that would be pretty much the end of the phone call. But he was just at heart, I think he was just a true short track racer.
Yeah.
And would have enjoyed, I think, had he done so, would have really enjoyed being back up here again.
Yeah, it's something that person, definitely wonders about, and never thought about that. But yeah, he's certainly a rock star up here, and I know really we all miss and love him dearly. That is for sure.
But the kind of a sad, there was another, there was kind of a sad point too. I remember being with him at Slinger one night toward the end of his life. And he said, I don't know if it's worth these promoters paying me to come up here anymore, because the fans are young and they don't really know who I am anymore. And he was with Carl Wagner and at Oktoberfest. And, at the end of the day, he said to Carl, he said, I only signed 2 autographs all day. And I think that had to be just really weighing on him, that, that whole career is gone, and people had moved on in many ways. Fans were different and maybe different fans, but I think about that too, and having an effect on his life at the end of it. But then, of course, we had Jimmy Bach. God, Jim was always he was so creative. It wasn't funny, And those, see, the other thing I think that made a real difference, I think about except for maybe 1 or 2. All the tracks were quarter-mile tracks when we started out.
Okay.
The Dells, Capitol, Wausau, Toma. And I think, so as a result, and the guys built their own cars, but they didn't really have to make huge changes when they went from track to track, because they were all the same distance.
Right.
Now, given it like Toma Sparta was kind of a hairpin or paperclip type of track,
mm-hmm.
But I think that one of the things that began to happen was, and that's where drivers didn't run a circuit so much, when you moved from like a 1/3 mile at Golden Sands to a 1/2 mile at Capitol, you had to, for a lot of them, they almost had to have a different car. They couldn't just make a few switches and changes and race. And so that, I think, had, to me at least, when I think about it, that may have had an effect on how often people raced. But, personally, and the thing is, when you think about like a person like Jimmy Bach, or you think about Tom or Dick or any of these guys, and they were building their own cars. And I know it seems shocking, but I asked Tom when he won 67 features, how much money did you have in your car? And he had probably like $6,000. And he made 44,000. There's take the percentage there. There's no driver today, I don't think, driving a short, winning $1,000 or whatever it is to win can make that, have that proportionate, expensive car compared to winnings.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely not.
No.
Definitely not.
And so there again, you look at those old drivers and their ingenuity, and and I remember times like they would be so creative, like with that left side weight and stuff, that you almost had to build a new car halfway through the season because to catch up with what a Tom or a Dick or somebody else was doing. And that was a big part of it too. It wasn't just watching them drive, but it was seeing them be so creative, and that all started out with just a simple thing like getting a 3/4 ton truck front right hub and putting that on the car because they were breaking them off all the time. So they strengthened that. Well, then when they strengthened that meant something else got weak and broke. So they made a whole circuit around that. And, but it was all their own ingenuity, and it was all their own shop work and so on. And, Jimmy was among the more creative. And the thing was, he welded without using goggles. So we always laughed about, by the end of the season, his glasses were all just specks, where the weld stuff had hit him. But and then Tom, like I never really saw it, but Tom had created a thing for tracking like shock movement, stuff like that he had in his car.
We still have it. It's sitting still in the shop.
Is it?
I can send you photos of it. Yep.
Yeah. But see, they were so, they just didn't race. They were their whole creativity was put into those cars and so on. And they also did things, and I didn't know this till about a year ago, but the top guys had a rule that you could buy, like during the week, you would all buy your tires on the same day. So they all kind of wore out then because they were racing the same tracks.
Yep.
They all kind of wore out evenly, and you might be able to add, like, among them a mutual agreement, one tire. But so instead of like bolting on 4 fresh tires for time trials and then another 4 fresh tires for your heat races and stuff, and then another 4 for feature.
Yeah.
They had a system where they were making money because they had figured out tires were one of the most expensive things. And
right.
This is what we're going to do to keep it from just getting out of control. And yeah. Then. Like another person that was Larry Deachens was just, that was a tragedy. But, Larry was just a really neat person. And again, like just had a huge fan base.
Yeah, I know that Larry Deachens was always, my dad and my uncle still talk about him. Yeah. But Larry was, obviously my grandpa was great friends with Dick and Jim Bach and Marv, but Larry was always someone that my grandpa really always talked about how special of a man he really was, and something that he really admired.
Mm-hmm. I always remember, and I was teaching at the seminary, and we had extra rooms because it was a boarding school, and so. I thought it would be pretty neat. Larry was going to race at Capitol.
Okay.
So I said, well, why don't you're racing here at the Dells, just drive down to the seminary. I'll get you a room, and you and your wife can just stay there and get up in the morning, come down and eat with us priests and go on. Well, they did come and stay, but they felt so uncomfortable that they just took off. I think that was a little bit too holy for them. I don't know. But it certainly would have been something we could have started a tradition.
Oh, sure.
But
yeah, so I'd like to touch on maybe just a little bit of, because I don't know much about some of the involvement you did have in NASCAR. Obviously, the writing. But any other, short track stories that come to mind that you wanted to touch on at all?
Well,
the one thing I will say for the listeners, what was when I had asked you if you could come up here and do this with me. You said, and I asked, I'm going to videotape this. I'm going to put this out here on these platforms. Are you okay with that? What was the one thing you told me you wouldn't do though?
What was it? I don't remember.
It was, you told me you would do anything I asked you to do except ride with Jimmy Bach after 2 days of welding.
Oh yeah. Then I wouldn't ride with Carl Wagner either.
When you said that, I thought that was funnier than heck. I laughed about that for days.
But I guess like the NASCAR thing. I flew with Bobby Allison a lot, and he had, and that was enjoyable. Just going to some of these different little short tracks that he would be involved in, and he had this Aerostar, which was a 2-engine plane, and he of course had it all tricked up so it was the fastest of the 2-engine planes with motors that there were, but we would do barrel rolls, and
no kidding.
And you could always tell, like if we would, and we took off. I think they finally banned it over there, but we'd take off from the drag strip at Kaukauna, and that was kind of a scary thing. It wasn't so bad landing, but when you took off, you came down off. Where the track, it would be that scrub off speed end of the track. You'd come down, and then you would take off down the runway, and you'd have to lift before you got to the staging area.
Sure,
for the
okay.
cars. You'd always be like, are we going to make this or not? But then he would always like take off, and then he would come fly back around, and he would come over the track, and right over the track, he would always do a barrel roll.
Really, I never heard that.
And
that's cool.
I always remember he would always tell a story about some priest that he had. I don't remember who the priest was, but he did a barrel roll, and the priest went like, "Oh shit," And so I told Bobby, I said, "I don't care if you fly me into the side of a mountain. I'm not going to say anything, because if I do, you'll tell that story over and over and over again."
Yeah.
But, and early, like when I look at it, early NASCAR racing was so different from what it is now. I've got pictures of like cement blocks with planks on them where they laid their tools out in the pits, and just different things like that. I think about it often. When I went to Daytona, I had a friend, Ed Roos, who had been to the first Daytona 500, and he had a hotel room right across the track. It was a Holiday Inn at the time.
Okay.
And so he kept that room year after year after year. In fact, when he passed away, I ended up keeping that room for a number of years. And you knew everybody in the hotel because it was the same people every year.
Okay.
So, but I always remember when Dale Earnhardt got killed in that accident. And I would always leave the door of the hotel open. You just did, because then people come in and visit, and I'd have mass on Saturday night, and like one year I had like Bobby Allison, Davey Allison, Bobby's parents, Alan Kowicki, and a couple of other people. But it was it was just really something to have all those guys together for a mass. But so anyway, when Earnhardt got killed, I was in my room, had the door open. People would come in, and they just wouldn't know what to say. They would just stand there, and then they would just turn and leave. They were just in such shock and sorrow. But yeah, Earnhardt was, and I had a good relationship with him. I visited with him. I stayed at his house a couple of times.
Really? Okay.
Went bow hunting with him one night, and he was just a really really neat person. Who else? Like Alan Kowicki, of course, he was a character of a different sort, but just highly intelligent. He had a Rolodex kind of mind that I remember one year at Daytona, he was having all kinds of troubles, so I just kind of left him alone. And then he would always call me about 7:30 in the morning, and he called and he said, "Where'd you go?" I said, "What do you mean, where'd I go?" So, well, I went down over to the hotel room to see if you were there, and you weren't there, and you didn't come down to my pit area and so forth. And I said, I knew you were having so much trouble, and I just didn't want to bother you. I wasn't going to go down and take pictures or do stuff like that. But that was the way he was. He just kept a catalog. And he could tell, like, if while he was driving, he was engineering. Like, he would tell people, you got to call back to the pits and say, you need to change the air pressure in this tire, just this amount or that amount.
Mm-hmm.
Or all those little kinds of things. But, and it was sad because he put so much of an effort into winning the championship, and he never really had a chance to enjoy life. Like he had a boat that he never used, and just different things like that. And I always remember the night that plane crashed. I had a church service, and I came back into the rectory, and Humpy Wheeler called me, and he said, you better call Alan's dad, because I've got firsthand information that Alan got killed in that plane crash. And he said, you better call him and tell him. So I called. I asked him what he was doing, and he said, well, I'm kind of surfing from TV station to TV station to see what the news is. And I said, I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but, I just got a call from Humpy Wheeler, and it looks as if Alan passed away. And right then, the telephone company broke into the call, and I always presumed it was somebody else, that was officially telling his dad that he had passed away. But then his dad asked me if I would have the funeral. So, I did the sermon and so forth for that funeral. But it was really, really something. There was a period of time, and when I look at Bobby, there was a period of time in his life, and as a result, it was a part of our life, where, like 1991, 92, 3, both of my parents passed away in 91. And then Bobby's dad passed away. And then, of course, Clifford got killed right about that time. And then Davy got killed in that helicopter crash. Mm-hmm. And then Neil Bonnet got killed in the opening practice at Daytona. It was just a very tough period of time, I think, like for Bobby, but also for me, because every time the phone would ring, you're going to be dealing with something that was very serious. Yeah. And that you were going to be a part of it. That was just a real kind of rough period of life in that regard. I often think about that. I was thinking of doing a sermon on Bobby and on just the difficulties that he had during that period of time, the bad news that was happening. But like he says, there were also good things that were happening, hopefully, the good and the bad, balance out, and you have some hope in life. But yeah, that was quite the era.
Yeah, that's a tough stint of people to lose, and like you said, dreading hearing the phone ring because you're just hoping it's not something that you're gonna have to deal with like that for sure.
Yep. But the other things, it's just I wouldn't, that whole period of racing, I wouldn't have missed it for anything. You just had people like Tom and Dick and Marv, and you just enjoyed being with them. You just enjoyed sharing life with them, and at heart they were always joyful people too. They really were.
Yeah. And so many of them were almost comedic. I think that's a word. But yeah, I mean, there's so many of them are funny and just a joy to be around. I mean, still a lot of racers are nowadays, but yeah, I mean, what a group of guys when you really just think about who they all were personality wise. I mean, yeah.
And then it wasn't just the drivers, but two of the people that I always really, really loved was Albert and Vic Getzlaff.
Oh yeah.
Albert was the tire man for the longest time, and Albert would do things like he would say, "Father, come along with me. I'm going to go and collect bills." And I said, "I'm going to tell those drivers, you either pay right now or you better square up with Father Grubba because you're going to either heaven or hell." And
let's bring the Lord into this. Yeah.
Albert always had something to say, and Vic, I had Vic's wedding, and then I think he was 70.
Okay.
And his wife said, "It's time you got baptized." We're getting to that point. So we scheduled Vic's baptism just because of his air flights and stuff.
Okay.
After a race in Madison, it was it was an afternoon race, and we were going to do it, and Johnny Sauter was going to be his sponsor.
Okay.
So anyway, Johnny, he just had a bad afternoon, so he had to go race to get into the race, and then he got into the race, and I was so proud of him because he started last as a result, worked his way all the way up to like third spot.
Yeah.
I thought, Johnny, you're doing great. Well, then, somebody spun him out. And of course, Johnny didn't, he caught up to the person and spun that guy out, but he didn't leave, he didn't back off. He just kept the guy spun out.
Yeah.
And so then we had to go from that to the baptism right afterwards. But at any rate, I always remember because it was great. But I'm in the baptismal ceremony, and there's all these other drivers gathered around, and guys, and they're kind of smiling and so forth. And so I turned to him and I said, "Now look," I said, "you have to remember this. When you're baptized, all your sins are forgiven, and all the punishment due to sin, it's gone. It's like clean slate." I said, "So here's Vic. When I baptize him, he's a saint. So don't you dare laugh at him, because you better congratulate him and be good to him, because he is the saint, But that was just part of the insight out of that. But that's why I think I've enjoyed my priesthood so much, is just being, in circumstances like that and being with people like that. But, there's so many of those things that I remember. I always, Dave Rodiger and Joanne were real close friends of mine. Dave was the inspector at a lot of those different tracks. And, he had those favorite expressions like, Pee-wee, you better pay attention or something. But Joanne had cancer of the larynx. And they did a surgery where they split that and took off the cancerous part. And she lived for a long time, quite a period of time after that. But Dave took care of her. And he would always tell a story about how he had to feed her, at the time. And then she ended up in the hospital passing away. And I said to him, I visited her the night before she passed away. And I said to Dave, I said, she's going to come back and tell you that she's okay and fine. And so she passed away. And then I saw Dave later in the day. And he said, it was really funny because I was driving home. And one of our favorite songs was Seven Spanish Angels. And he said, what song came on the radio as I'm driving home but Seven Spanish Angels? And then he said, I was sitting in the backyard, I think with his cousin. And he said, as we're sitting there was this hummingbird that came and it just flew around. And he said, we never have hummingbirds in our yard. Never. But he said it was just a sign, I think, that she was there and that it all was safe. But and then Dave passed away from cancer too. But I always remember I visited him every week, and the social worker came and said, they ask all those questions, and they asked him, what religious affiliation are you? He said, well, I'm Lutheran, but Father Grubba is my priest. And then, so I had his funeral too, and but they were just beautiful people. But I think one of the things that and I didn't really know it because I came kind of into their life later in their life. But Dave had a very violent temper, just really so. And it got to the point where he, in a fit of anger, smashed all of the furniture on the deck at their house. And his wife called the police. And so the police came, and then he had to go for counseling. And the first time he went to the counselor, he got so angry that he walked out and he slammed the door, and the counselor said everything on the wall shook. And so then, he came back a second time, same story. He got angry, slammed the door, and everything shook. But then the third time, the counselor said, look, he said, you are either going to do this counseling or you're going to jail. And, and Dave took that very seriously and totally changed, became a whole different man. In fact, he and Joanne were driving up to the Dells to the races one night or someplace, and they forgot the tickets. It must have been a show or something. And Joanne said, have you got the tickets? And he said, no. And then she said, I don't either. And she said before he would have just gotten so angry, he would have slammed on the dash and so forth. But she called the counselor and she said, I don't know what you've done to him, but he's a totally different person. And then Dave went on to be a speaker at when this counselor would have other groups,
Mm-hmm.
he would be a speaker at those groups.
Really? Okay.
And I had that counselor come and speak at his funeral, because I had his funeral and Joanne's funeral. That's why there's been so many, I've been involved in so many people's lives, but that's what's been the richness of my life, is just sharing, being with these people and sharing their stories and their things. But yeah, I remember, I'm not going to remember his name. The flagman, Dwayne Sweeney. Dwayne Sweeney was the flagman at the Milwaukee Mile, and he was also flagman at Indianapolis.
Okay.
And at that time, Russ Lake was running a charity in Milwaukee. And I got to the charity, and as soon as I got there, a couple people came up and they said, Dave Sweeney's in the hospital and he really wants you to come and visit him. And then another person, Dave Sweeney's in the hospital and he really wants you to come and visit him. So I went to visit him, and the family was gathered around in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And I could tell that Dave was really just agitated. But I also sensed something. So, I said, Dave, you really wanted me here, didn't you? I said, you want to go to confession, don't you? And he said, yeah. So then I cleared the room, and I heard his confession. And then everybody came back into the room. And it was the neatest thing in the world, because Dwayne, every so often, they'd be talking about all this other stuff, and Dwayne would interrupt everything, and he'd say, I'm clean. I'm clean. I'm clean. And then the conversation would go on, and then he would come back and say, I'm clean. I'm clean. I'm clean. And, there's just been, so many things like that make life so rich and so rewarding, to be a part of things like that. But, I guess some of that stuff I haven't thought about in a long time.
Yeah, no, I think with all this stuff that you've done, I look at, I got, for all the listeners that don't have or seen the video, I have 5 books that are sitting out here that Father Dale Grubba has written, and I think, with you being a part of all those people's lives and capturing, all these moments and putting them into these books and being with them and for them in those moments, whether it was, in their final moments or in their good times, I think you've brought a lot of richness to their life as well that they'll always appreciate, and their families will always appreciate. I want to talk about your writing a little bit in some of your books, but I think let's go into that. You talked about how many books have you written? I think the ones that
I started out and I wrote Dream Chasing, and that was the first one. And the neat thing about that one was it had pictures of all of the drivers that were in that racing in that era.
Mm-hmm.
Then I did one that was like this in format and size, and it was called Wisconsin's Finest. And then what happened was a publisher came along and said, why don't we put stuff from both of those together and also new materials and put this book out? And I said, why would I want to do that? Because we've already covered that stuff. But that book turned out to be the very, very popular. I think I sold
the golden age of Wisconsin racing.
Yeah, it did. I would guess we sold probably 4,000 copies of that. And then that went out of existence. And then I did a prayer book, and I'm thinking of reworking that, because what I did was, after I had it written, I got all the autographs of all the different drivers that are in it, pretty much. So I'm thinking of adding some pages to it, because they're with current drivers in the thought, but then also adding the autographs that are in the book, as another part of it. So I may do that, and then I guess from there, then the next one was that Milwaukee Modified book, and then 67. Well, in between there too was the Alan Kowicki. The Alan Kowicki book actually came out before the Milwaukee Modified book.
Okay.
And then the 67 was the final one. But for some reason, when I start out, like, this is, I think, 484 pages. And the Milwaukee Modified book is 484 pages too, I think, just by coincidence. But I've never been able to write a short book. In fact, the thing is, other writers like Dave Kallman and stuff, they get these because they know that everything's in them. That if they're going to do research, they start here.
Yeah.
And somebody made a smart remark and said, it even says in the book what time they turn the lights out at Capitol Speedway on such and such a date. They're that detailed, but that's the type of person I am. Detail matters to me, and especially when it came to the racing and so on. But yeah.
So you'd always kind of, when did you really start thinking, hey, did you just kind of start collecting some of these stories and just, hey, I'm going to kind of keep track of some of the stuff you talked about keeping track of who won when you went, but did you just start writing stuff down and it was like, you know what, this should be turned into a book?
Well, basically what happened was, first of all, I loved writing. I wanted, I can remember trying to write stories when I was and I still have. I was just looking at some notes the other day in my moving of things that I wrote in grade school, that were stories.
Sure.
And but see, I was doing those columns. I started doing the columns for Checkered Flag in 1976.
Okay.
So it was 76 to 82, where I was kind of building up a lot of collecting a lot of stories and so on. So the two kind of went naturally together because I guess I have a pretty good memory. So if I was doing all these interviews or if I was experiencing all this stuff at the track, I would remember it enough. And then I would go back and do the research when I started to write the books to flesh it out and to fill it out. Okay.
And I know, like the book 67, for instance, 484 pages. How long was the writing process? And I mean, really, how long were you having to, when you had the idea, hey, I'm going to write this book 67, and how long did that time period take of, all right, hey, now I got to go and talk to some of these drivers again and start collecting some more information?
Most of them, if I had to put a guess on it, most of them was probably like 5 years.
5 years, okay.
5 or 6. Just because the research and, like you say, and I had a lot of other things going on in my life, so it wasn't like I could sit down and write, for a certain period of time. Although I'd like to, but my life isn't organized that way. So it would take, I would say, 5 to 7 years.
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the first times that I really, really remembered seeing you around a racetrack was, I think I was at the Slinger Nationals, and I remember you being there having a notebook, and I don't know if it was talking to Dick Trickle or something like that, and just writing and asking questions, and then maybe around like the Larry Deaches Memorial or something, asking my grandpa questions in the trailer and taking notes. So that was and then handful of years later, the book 67 comes out, and there it is. So,
I've still got all those notebooks. I often think I should sit down and go and see if there are any stories that I didn't put in books that are in the notebooks.
Sure. The when did you kind of come to the notion, hey, I'm gonna write 67? What stuck out? Was it just how that feat of winning 67 features that said, there's got to be something on this?
Well, it was that desire. It was a desire to preserve that era of history was kind of behind it. Mm-hmm. But also, I think the thing that drove me more than anything else was the fact that 67 looks so out of the world, impossible now.
Yeah.
If when I come up to some of the modern drivers and I say, Tom Reffner won 67 features, or Dick Trickle won 67 features in 1 year, they look at you and they go like, 1 year? It's like it's almost an impossibility in their mind that you can do that. And I think that was, I didn't want that to be lost, because that's a tremendous, we talk about every record is made to be broken.
Yep.
But I don't know if you're ever going to break that. Things would have to change an awful lot.
Yeah.
First of all, you'd have to find somebody with really deep pockets who's going to finance all of that.
Yeah. The mission would definitely have to be to try and beat that and not worry about anything else.
And not worry about anything else. And then, you would have to find. See, the thing is, like all these tracks ran, consistently for the summer. So you could easily line up 5 or 6 tracks and get to them every week.
Right.
And you can't do that now because, so like what Wausau maybe ran 10 races.
Yeah, 12 some around there, yeah.
12 some. And Golden Sands. Same.
Probably equivalent, yeah.
Yeah. So, you couldn't, what you would have to do is you'd have to have some guy not only you'd have to have a guy that with an airplane and a car at all these different tracks, so that you could, if you were racing, if they were racing in Southern Illinois on a Thursday night every week, so that you could fly from wherever you were to that track, race there, and then fly someplace else, because. Like I said, 105 races. Like when Dick won those, he was racing pretty much at local tracks. Mm-hmm. Like Tom, it was a different story. He ran, that was during Artco and so forth. So he ran like in Berlin and a number of other tracks in Illinois, Grundy and places like that.
Okay.
But Dick's 67 came mostly out of local track racing.
Okay.
And so. But see, you couldn't accumulate 105 races I don't think in Wisconsin or in any given area, and being on that board of directors for Alan Kowicki and looking at these other drivers who compete, there's not a lot of areas in the United States that really have that much racing anymore. Like the Northwest is kind of thin.
Right.
Maine and that area is kind of thin. So it may be someday, but for the immediate future, nobody's going to break that.
Yeah. Yeah, you never say never, but yeah, that's certainly it. So we have covered a lot, but is there anything that people should know about you that we haven't covered yet that you'd like people to know about you?
I think we've pretty well covered it. I think just the fact that, one of the things is that I honestly think that I just have been so blessed within life that it isn't funny. I've been blessed in the people that I've known. I've been blessed with the things that I've been able to do. Like just for instance, one of the things that Kurt Busch did was, and it was probably one of the highlights of my career, is, Kurt Busch did the double where he went from Indianapolis to Charlotte.
Yep.
And when he did that, he asked if I would go along with him.
Okay.
And I just said yes, not really thinking about what it was. And then I was in the airport going to Charlotte because we were going to start out in Charlotte and fly to Indianapolis. And Dave Kallman called me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, I'm going down to Charlotte to the race. And then I'm going to be with Kurt Busch. And Dave Kallman said, "But that's a big story. I got to do a story on that." And I thought of it, just kind of like ordinary part of life. But,
sure.
But when I look back on it, Kurt wanted me to be his good luck charm. And what I was supposed to do was say mass for him in the morning and then stand right by his car in Indianapolis and be the last person to leave the car, and then fly back with him to Charlotte and do the same in Charlotte. And so, we flew up in Tony Stewart's. There was a doctor and a nurse and myself and Kurt. And we went to Concord Airport, flew in Tony Stewart's jet up to Indianapolis. And then we got up in the morning about 3 o'clock, got out to the racetrack. And then later I said mass for Kurt. And then went and stood right by his car, the whole time. And it was really neat because you had like Roger Penske and all these people walking by, and to be a part of that scene. And then 50 laps, we went to Mario Andretti's suite because it was an Andretti car that he was driving. And 50 laps from the end, the doctor and nurse and I got helicoptered out of the infield over to the airport, because then when Kurt finished the race, he could quickly get to the airport. We'd all be there, and then we'd take off and fly back to Charlotte. And and then they fed him intravenously, and we got back to Charlotte. And I'm probably the only person that ever gave a person a blessing at the start of Indianapolis and then at the start of the 600. There were just things like that if you had, like I said, if you had asked me at the start of my career, "Are you going to be doing stuff like that?" I said, "No."
Who'd have thought, right?
You're dreaming. But that's why, my life has just been so blessed. But it's also blessed with just this, not just with memories from people like Kurt Busch or that, but it's also been blessed with the people like Vic Getzlaff and the people on the other end of the spectrum who I love and have a tremendous respect for, and it's been so great to share life with all of those people. And I think that would be, the key, the parting message is just that, I've always been a people person, and it's been, and parish life has been great for me. We've done crazy, spin-offs from racing also have affected, like, my priesthood. For instance, midnight masses, at midnight, there aren't many of those anymore, and I don't want to give it up because, like, this year I celebrated my 58th. I've got 2 more, and I'll be at 60. But the crowd was going down. So I had to figure out, how am I going to attract a crowd? Well, part of Humpy's show was the pre-race stuff. There was always, sometimes the pre-race stuff was greater than the 600. There were like bus jumps where he'd have people jumping buses over the Berlin Wall, and then the wall would explode as they went over. So I got this idea that I wanted to do fireworks after the midnight mass. and I had two parishes. I had Neshgoro and Princeton. So we started out, I found a guy that would do it. And we're up at Neshgoro, and we put on a fireworks show afterwards. It was as great as any small town fireworks show. And so anyway, afterwards, I heard the story that somebody called the police and said, there's shooting going on the north side of Neshgoro. And then somebody who had been at Mass called up and said, nah, it's just Grubba celebrating Mass at Christmas. Then we do that after the midnight Mass at Princeton, and invariably you'd hear the police sirens, and then they'd turn them off about when they realized, that it was just Grubba up at the church. But somebody asked me once, how did you ever get permission to do all that? And I thought, I didn't say anything. I thought, I never did get permission.
I was going to ask that, what did the township have to think about that?
Well, the town just,
Small town,
and they always knew Grubba was going to pull something like that. And then I had a school at Princeton too, and Paul Stender, had this show that he did put together, and it was all kinds of jet vehicles, like a jet car, but then he had a jet beer truck that went, I think, 192 miles an hour, and he had a jet school bus that went 300 miles an hour, and he had a jet four-wheeler. And so at the opening of school or at the close of school, I'd get Stender to bring one of his vehicles up. And I'll never forget, I've got pictures of this. The most impressive was the jet school bus. And the flames from that, the heat from that, it probably shot flames out at least, I'd say 200 feet, and but the thing was, it got hot, like the people that were standing could feel the heat from it, but it also melted the surface of the blacktop on the road that it was sitting on, because we had to be stationary. We couldn't run the thing,
right.
Because we didn't have distance enough. So, and the kids got so that they knew right after he shut them down, they knew that if they went out there, their feet would stick to the pavement. So the first thing they'd do is all the kids would go running down to see if their feet would stick to the pavement. But there were just things like that where, what was it? But anyway, this is another. Stender ended up in the hospital. His kidneys failed and his liver failed. And I don't know why, but the doctor told him he was going to die on March 27th. And so anyway, I visited him. I visit him quite often. And so about 2-3 weeks before, I thought, I better anoint him, and get him prepared for death. And so I anointed him. And then I thought, about a week before, I thought, I better go down there again and anoint him, because, and so, and that was during the pandemic. And so I went down and I said, Paul, I'm going to anoint you again, because now it's like 4 or 5 days for March 27th. And he looks at me and he says, "Why are you anointing me again? You just anointed me about 2 weeks ago." I said, "Yeah, but I think knowing you, you need a booster shot." But anyway, now he never did die. And he walks around and he tells people, Father Grubba anointed me 4 times in the course of it. But, it's just, we could sit here and, as we go along, all these different things come back to mind, and I haven't thought about them for a long time, but it's funny how some of these things do. But Paul still, he and I still go back and forth. But see, a lot of that stuff, a lot of the things that I learned, that's why I enjoyed Humpy Wheeler so much, because he was such a showman and he was so creative. And as a result, that had an effect on things that I was doing too. And it had an effect too, even like in my church services, which, took on a kind of a whole life of their own. And, and I still, like now, I still enjoy doing my Facebook masses and YouTube masses, and and I enjoy doing my invocations at racetracks, and then just a lot of things like that. But it's just it just has been just a great career, just a great career.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would definitely agree to that, and I appreciate you coming here and sharing all these stories. And I got to say, just looking at what you've done with a lot of these books and capturing these stories, there's really a lot of inspiration behind me wanting to do some of this, and with this podcast. And I like to write, but I definitely do not have the ability to capture someone's story and make it good and put it into words for people to read. So I took the easy way out and bought a pair of mics and figured people could sit down and talk and people can just hear it right from the person themselves. So, you talked about potentially the book you would maybe work on was on Matt Kenseth and Robbie Reiser.
Yep.
And any other works in the books currently, whether it's a book or something else?
I've got, I did write one novel, Return of Elijah, and I'm writing another one now, and it's much longer, much bigger, and it's on Dismas, the good thief. Remember, at the crucifixion, there's a good thief and the bad thief.
Yep.
Dismas is the good thief. Justus is the bad thief. But there was a legend that when the persecution of the innocents took place, that there was a soldier that shielded the other soldiers and they were killing everybody 2 years and younger, shielded Jesus from being killed, and his name is Dismas, and so it's Dismas that ends up being at the crucifixion, but the space between there is never written about, or nobody knows anything about it. So my novel is about Dismas experiencing the Christ child and it having such an impact upon him that he spends the rest of his life pursuing and trying to get back to and find out who Christ was and get him back in his life. So that's the novel. See, and it's, for me, like, part of this whole thing is, I did my master's degree in American history, so history is a part of my bloodstream.
Mm-hmm.
That's why writing these books about the history of racing is important. But the history of like Dismas and Christ time and all this is also it's easy for me, and I'm attracted to the idea of researching and writing about, what kind of guy Herod was, how, he was so vicious that Augustus, who was the ruler of the whole Roman Empire, said that he would rather be Herod's pig than his relatives, because Herod practiced Judaism, but he anybody that ever tried to, he thought in the least way was going to try to take over his kingdom, he killed. He killed, he had 10 wives, but he had one, Maximilius, that he really, really loved. But she wanted her 2 sons to take his place, so she got involved in a plot along with her mother to do away with Herod. Well, Herod found out about it and had her put to death. And then his 2 sons, he caught up with them, put them to death. And then he put a couple more of his sons to death. So all of that is history, but it's to me, I can work it into a novel, a historical novel.
Yeah.
And just a lot of other things. So I'm working on that. That'll be probably end up being quite long too.
Yeah.
But I've only got about 3 chapters left. I'm at chapter 23 right now, out of what I think will be about 27, 28.
Okay.
But we'll see how that goes.
Cool. So I think I mentioned it earlier, Father Grubba and Friends on Facebook is kind of where people can follow some of where you're giving Mass and some of the churches you're being at.
Yep.
Okay.
And we do the weekend Masses there.
Okay.
So every weekend we put up, the Mass for the weekend.
Okay.
And then I do pictures of churches that I visit. But we also, have, like we did when I was restoring that shrine, I was out there all the time taking pictures of everything that was going on. I just wanted to make sure I had that captured in pictures.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot. Any last words or anything else?
No, thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
It's it has been an honor and a blessing. And I think when I first had the thought of doing all this, you were one of the first people I wanted to make sure I could bring on and wanted to talk to. So it's like I said, it's a blessing to be able to have you to set this amount of time aside to come up here and tell your story. And that's kind of part of it too. Is you've done so much, capturing so many other people's life stories. People need to hear, about Father Dale Grubba and the things that you've done and been a part of. So it's, like I said, it's been an honor to have you up here, and I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you
for inviting me.
All right. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All right.